Welcome to Offshift Fireside Chats, Edward Snowden.
Thank you, Alex. It's good to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. For those just tuning in who may not be familiar, Offshift is a cryptocurrency project that is pioneering PriFi, that is private decentralized finance, and it's all on Ethereum layer 1. That means no ifs, ends, or bridges. In addition to conducting industry-leading research and building out a couple platforms to protect user privacy on layer 1 blockchain ecosystems, we are also very focused on bringing in thought leaders from around the privacy space, from cryptocurrency in different areas, to produce some educational and highly thought-provoking content for our community and for those beyond. So today, Ed, we're really pleased to have you on. To everyone also listening in, my name is Alex Shipp. I am the CSO at Offshift, and I manage and handle most of our public-facing endeavors. That means usually I'm on the receiving side of the interviews. I present at conferences, and you'll see me very active in the Offshift Telegram. Today, I'm really excited for our session, which is Down the Rabbit Hole, Cryptocurrency's Ever-Receding Promise of Privacy. I do want to let you know, Ed, that the rest of our team, who are all anonymous, have been very much inspired by the decisions you've made and the actions you've taken, the stand you've taken, your principles, and they would love to be sitting here face to face. And so, it's an honor to be able to represent not only myself, but the whole team. And I'll also let you know on my own behalf that I just rewatched Citizen 4 last night, so I am at peak inspiration and ready to go. Before we dive in and go down the rabbit hole, is there anything you would like to share?
People ask me like what I'm working on, what I'm doing, and right now people aren't really familiar with it because, unless they follow me on Twitter, nobody hears it. And I haven't been tweeting much recently anyway. I am now the father of 2 children that are under 2 years old. So I'm not getting any sleep. I'm not getting any work done. I have about an hour of free time every day, and that's about it. Maybe after the rest of the family's all in bed, and that's what we're using right now. So, no. By means of self-introduction, because you said you just finished watching Citizen 4. Which is a film came out in 2013, 2014 era, which for a lot of people, particularly younger people that might be watching this right now, probably seems like a long time ago. Who I am is just an ordinary guy. I was a government worker, a technology consultant for U.S. intelligence agencies. There are a lot of tech workers nowadays who, worked in the government or think about working for the government, or they get a security clearance. Now it's a very different type of person, a very different type of crowd than it was back then, because people didn't really know what these intelligence agencies were doing to the internet. And that's what I am known for largely, is revealing that what the public was told, and even workers in these intelligence agencies broadly believed, was very different from the practical reality of what was being done. If you only assessed the government's activities based on even their sworn testimony in front of Congress, where it would be a felony to lie, they were extremely, extremely boring hearings that looked like this.
Does the NSA routinely intercept American citizens' emails? No. Does the NSA intercept Americans' cell phone conversations? No. Google.
Right. So fascinating. It goes on Google conversations, all of these different things. And then you've got the most senior, that was the chief of the NSA at the time who was being asked that. Sworn testimony saying, no, none of this is happening. Then you have Senator Ron Wyden, who is a member of the Senate Oversight Committee for Intelligence. He's the guy who's supposed to be getting the truth of what the intelligence agencies are doing, make sure they're complying with the law, that they're not doing these kind of things. And they get the head of all U.S. intelligence, then Director of National Intelligence, a man by the name of James Clapper. And he asked him a very specific question that he knew the answer to, because, again, remember, the guy asking the question has classified knowledge. And this guy lies directly to his face, even though he knows it's a lie. But more importantly, that guy knew the truth. He couldn't tell us because it was classified. He was against the programs. But everybody else that was watching throughout the country and throughout the world was being misled. And that looked something like this.
So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
So that was a lie. He knew that was a lie. That was a crime, and he was never punished for that. I, working at the NSA, talking to my colleagues about this, I was one of the few people who had the access to see what was actually going on, saw that, in fact, the government was partnering with all of the major sort of American internet giants to get access to data from their servers that they were handing over through secret process with agencies like the FBI that were used to basically then launder it to the NSA. And it just went on and on and on. In fact, the entire cellular network, far beyond these intelligence partnerships, our activities, our movements, our sort of connections to cell phone towers, location records, calling histories, were being productized. And if you were an AT&T customer, right, they were holding your calling records going back to 1987. When were you born? Right? Every call you ever made that ever crossed their network that connected to an AT&T customer, they had. And they were selling this to law enforcement agencies, not to stop kidnappings and save lives, but to see who had a baggie of weed. And then your movements, right, going back to 2008. These are sort of your cellular tower associations. And I mean, it goes on and on and on. We saw that their partners, so what was called the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. This is the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. We're working to find anything on the internet, any data flow that was not encrypted, that was not designed to be private, was being exploited. It was simply being gathered by collective national efforts to sort of punch on the wires that connect the internet together, the fiber optic bearers that are buried under the ground, that travel under the sea. And they would all sort of share their buckets together under a hodgepodge of sort of legal regimes. And then they would create their own search engines internally that would let them sift through this. All of your communications, all of my communications, all of everyone's communications everywhere that crossed the gaze of these institutions were being collected without any regard to whether they had done anything wrong, without regard to whether they had fallen under any criminal suspicion. They were simply collected because they could. And they went in the bucket and they went in the archive, the sort of library. They go up on the shelf. And then they say this is entirely legal because they're not using it. They think sort of constitutional protections, legal protections really only kicked in when they took all of those communications about you off of the shelf, right? Turned to your page and you at this time, on this day, did this, talked to this person, read this on the internet, connected to your messaging app at this time, checked the weather at this time. That, for them, was a search with legal implications.
And that's just the informational piece, right? I mean, right. I mean, so, what's quite fascinating then is that, now we're moving into this sort of next iteration of the internet, into the crypto space where now wealth is being exchanged. And I want to refer to an article that you published called Your Life and Your Money. Your Money and Your Life on your blog in October 2021, where you really take a deep dive into CBDCs and also go through sort of a nice, pretty lengthy history of money, banking, financial institutions, and other things. And you referred to CBDCs as, I'm going to read off here, crypto-fascist currencies, an evil twin entered into the ledger on opposite day, and a perversion of cryptocurrencies. And you're certainly not going to find any disagreements from me here. But CBDCs are, to me, they really speak to the aphorism that all technology is agnostic. which is to say, that, and in particular, that blockchain is agnostic. These are really sort of pivotal times because blockchains can support decentralized systems that preserve individual freedoms, including privacy, but they can also support tyrannical, technocratic, digital prisons, so to speak. And so blockchain technology and the crypto space in general are at a very nascent stage, but we sort of see these two parallel systems emerging. One which is built on decentralization and protecting individual liberties, and then we have the other one with the CBDC angle that can support credit scores and a lot of other authoritarian measures. And I don't think that second avenue really gets a lot of attention. And so as someone who's been sort of keeping their eye on all these things for decades, I want to ask, like, how bad, could things get? What is this sort of dystopian nightmare that we could have in 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question to ask there is, what is the dystopian nightmare that we're existing in today? When you look at the history of sort of government authority, at least in the United States, what information can they get with a warrant? What do you have to hand over to the government? Who is responsive to this? There is actually not a long history in the United States of the government being able to say, you have to help us bank. You need to give us all the information about this person's transactions. We're going on an investigation. Or what's much worse, what we see happening today with like Google, where they'll get what's called a geofence warrant. And the feds say, we want to know everyone who is within, 500 feet of this building or 5 miles of this building at this time on this day, because we want to see if any of these phones are at other locations. And, we're trying to basically create patterns to infer a suspect where previously one did not exist. Traditionally, warrants were limited in the United States to only be able to sort of search for and seize the fruits and instrumentalities of a crime. That means if they're looking for somebody who robbed a bank, right, they could get the loot back that the guy took. They could get his crowbar, they could get the gun that he used, the mask, and all of these things, and then show them to the court. But they couldn't go to the local general store and say, you have to provide all of the receipts for anybody who bought crowbars for the last 3 months. That is very much new. That history in the United States only goes back to about 1968. Now, of course, particularly in the post 9/11 moment, we have all of the finance institutions that are very much subordinated and subordinated by the government and deputized to the government to act as agents of federal authority. And it's not just the United States, it's every country everywhere, because their sort of financial laws, KYC and AML regulations, know your customer, and anti-money laundering regulations are not really about protecting anybody. They're about controlling the flows of power in the world, power that is derived from the transmission and movement of money. This was, of course, justified on the basis of preventing terrorism in 9/11. What were these laws used for? What kind of crimes did they stop? Not really anything. They didn't really save any lives. I think the only real crime that in the wake of 2013, this sort of mass surveillance story came out, that was revealed by the government's own investigations when they were trying to defend these programs, was a cab driver transplant from Somalia who ended up living and working in California, wiring $8,300 back to his clan in Somalia, who happened to be on the terrorist list, somebody in Al-Shabaab. And so think about this. We have really a half century and increasingly, 2 decades now of increasing intrusion into and sort of scrutiny of everyone's monetary transactions and interactions to a greater and greater depth, with a lesser and lesser sort of burden of evidence put upon the government before they can do these kind of things. There is less friction for the government to act and less protection for us to act freely and privately without prejudgment or prejudice or, God forbid, sort of the interference of the law in private affairs that aren't hurting anybody or whatever. The idea of free and private trade is intentionally being erased as a matter of policy, not simply by the government of the United States, but all governments of any size and sort of complexity and organization. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why? And that very much is the question. And I think if you ask me, we are always told the justification is public safety, and yet we don't see, public safety benefits trumpeted on the front page of newspapers. That, in fact, almost never happens. And of course, because these are largely unpopular policies, if they could do that, they would. And the real answer is these are levers of control that allow these large institutions, both corporate and governmental, to shape society and direct it in a way that benefits and advantages them. Now, we like to think of the government in places like the United States as representing us. I mean, some people on this call will probably laugh at the idea, but for the average person, right, we like to believe that governments are acting sort of for our benefit. But does that continue to be true? Are the people who populate these institutions of finance and government, are they even drawn from the same class as us? Do they identify with us? Do they see themselves as the same type? Or do they sort of owe allegiance to some other factions in society? And I think very much that they do. And the only way that we can protect anyone in this new sort of world of transparency for the powerless and privacy for the powerful, from the selective enforcement of laws, from the selective sort of performance of transparency, in this case, rather exposure for people that they don't like, who are uncomfortable. For example, in Canada recently, there were protests. They were trying to stop sort of money flows and banning donations and all of this crazy stuff. The only way that we can make sure that people can act on equal ground is to make sure, like, basically the best way to protect anyone is to protect everyone. If we have these selective beneficial powers that are granted to institutions that have an established record of acting abusively for, what's going to very soon be centuries, it begins to look less like progress and more like the commission of a mistake.
It certainly brings to mind the famous quote from Glenn Greenwald, who said that transparency is for those who carry out public power or exercise public power and carry out public duties, and privacy is for everyone else. And we're kind of living in an inversion of that, where it seems like most people seem to believe that privacy is for those in places of power and transparency is for everyone else. So,
I mean, that's the way the system very much seems structured. It's exactly that. Like, baked into our language is that very concept. We all know the phrase, the private citizen, and we all know the phrase, the public official. But why is it that we don't know what public officials are doing? We don't know what public figures are doing. But for the private citizen, we are increasingly scrutinized, tracked, quantified, and measured. We are nudged. We are manipulated. As you say, precisely correctly, I think we have inverted the traditional model of how we protect society from power. When there are great powers, privacy is the shield against the too easy application of it, right? Power should be burdensome to express. It should be the last resort, something that is sort of only used when it must be, because it's costly, it's expensive, it's hard, it's difficult, it's controversial, politically, it's hard to justify. Now, all of these powers are used routinely, they're used frictionlessly, and there is no appeals process, even if we're talking about something as simple as PayPal.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why, though, with all of these exciting sort of systems that are being built on blockchain, this sort of decentralized ecosystem, sometimes referred to as Web3, but what we like to call cryptocurrency, is that there are a lot of sort of ways of leveling the playing field with decentralized systems. And the question is, can we get privacy in there and keep it there? Certainly in the last few years, as DeFi has taken center stage, privacy has been relegated to the back burner. And Ethereum, which is designed for Turing completeness and programmability, does not support protections for user privacy. So, I really go back to you've been at Ethereal, been interviewed the last 2 years. And in particular in 2021, I want to read your quote because you made some very emphatic statements about on-chain privacy. That means privacy in these decentralized systems on layer one, where you said, I just like to, read it straight out. Which is that cryptocurrency and Bitcoin are really failing comprehensively and terribly on the privacy angle. And you speak a bit about how Taproot is a totally insufficient privacy solution. You go on to say, which I think was even more powerful, that the internet already allows us to do tremendous things, but it's being controlled. It's being exploited. And the financial aspect is where a lot of this control is entering through. And so you say altcoins need to be private or they are failing. This is my position. And that really spoke to me. I lifted that quote and used it in an op-ed in CoinDesk, and with due credit to you, of course. But it's nice to be able to say thank you face to face. But I think private on-chain privacy is kind of presented now as this sort of niche sector of crypto, where it really should be center stage. It should be the part of the value proposition that is it should be integral. And so it was, to say that altcoins, if they are not private, they are failing. How important is on-chain privacy, or how important should it be?
I think right now it's very clear with the push in the United States where cryptocurrency has lobbyists, right? There is a legalization effort that is getting off the ground and going around the world. And what we do right now, crypto as it exists, is something we may have to live with for a very long time in terms of how it interacts with the legacy world, like these old states. And I think for people like the folks working on Bitcoin, they have been reluctant to bake privacy into their sort of layer one. And when we look at altcoins, largely, of course, there are privacy-focused alternatives that have done a very good job. But some of the most popular chains don't do this. They leave it to a smart contract, something like Tornado Cash to sort of do. But there is so much inference and other activity on the chain that as the world moves towards an on-chain existence or a side-chain existence or whatever, this is going to make the problems that we have from sort of great institutional manipulation of the common citizen become a problem where there are many, many, many more actors doing this. We already have predatory groups like chain analysis kind of companies that are making this their business. To sort of pry into people's private interactions and trades online. And it's simply, again, a for-profit activity for them. Those people should be out of business, not because we don't like them or whatever, but because their work should not be possible. The fact that it is possible brings us back to the original sin of the pre-2013 world, right? Before it was proven and established beyond a reasonable doubt by the government's own classified documents that they were basically exploiting our faith in the security and the privacy of our communications, which were not encrypted as they crossed the global network, simply because they were going through the hands of private companies, right? They were going through other people's computers, but we thought people were just acting in good faith. But it turned out that every hop of that network was hostile, right? And that is what is going to happen to the cryptocurrency world. And I think in a much larger fraction than people are aware of today is already happening, right? How many peers in any particular cryptocurrency network are simply going, which IP sent this packet out? Who is connected to me to request the balance of this address because they're not running a full node, right? And they're just taking notes, they're copying this all down, and then maybe they're selling it, maybe it's being used for governmental purposes, maybe it's a research effort, whatever. What's happening is all of these people who do not realize their activities are being sort of monitored, particularly because they believe the old adage that like Bitcoin is anonymous, which is very much not true. We all know now, but people still believe that they are harmed by it. And I think the harms are going to increase as we depend on these networks more. And just to bring it back to the central point, if we do not move to private by design, cryptocurrency networks, and make that a fait accompli, there will be governments that legislate against the potential of it. We already see efforts to begin in different, jurisdictions, and a lot of people go, "Oh, well, they can't, code is speech and all of these things." And well, China banned Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's still there. Yes, of course, but if people are going to use this everywhere, right? We need the network to be available everywhere. We need to avoid attempts at interference in the same way the governments really struggle just to interfere with the basic encryption requests to the websites that you read, right? You connect to Wikipedia and it's HTTPS. That's an encrypted connection. They might try to man in the middle of that, but every part of our software stack is designed to try to reveal that. Your browser throws up a certificate warning. It goes, there's an error. It goes, the certificate's out of date. It's bad. It's flawed. It's stolen. It's on a revocation list, whatever. But nobody is just sending their communications in the clear, and they shouldn't be. Why would we do that with our money, which is one of the most intimate expressions of association that a person engages with? That's what you eat, that's what you read, that's where you go, that's who you donate to, that's what you support, right? You might not be buying your groceries with cryptocurrency today, but you will in 10 years.
Yeah. It's funny because everyone knows this sort of, it's a meme at this point that, Facebook or Meta is evil, that these social media companies monetize your data. But they don't realize is that what's already happening and what's very much on the way in the blockchain space is that companies are literally monetizing your money. And whether it's Nansen and Chainalysis doing it for with their on-chain data analytics, or if it's just Robinhood, they make $700 million a year, or they did at least in 2020 selling user data to hedge funds. So it's really quite the business. Knowing what people do with their money is sometimes, and very, very understandably, more valuable than knowing what they're thinking about or what their Google searches are.
Sure.
And so, certainly though, as you say, and I couldn't agree more that, we're both believers in free markets and freedom empirically. And so we're not calling for any sort of company that's doing on-chain data analysis to be shut down. There should be no force involved, but the market should also there should be significant market demand for privacy-centric services that provide privacy for users on-chain, whether they're in DeFi or anywhere else. And as privacy certainly should be built into the system. To us at Offshift, zero-knowledge proofs, and I think a lot of people, Barry Silbert and others, maybe Barry most notably, but have sort of spoken to this trend, which is already taking off a little bit in 2022, but that in the years to come, that zero-knowledge proofs will sort of be the secret sauce and one of the biggest parts of one of the biggest catalysts for development in the crypto space. And not only for privacy, but for scalability as well. A lot of ZK rollups and things out there to improve performance. So, I'm curious though. We want to know sort of your outlook on whether zero-knowledge proofs will turn out to be the big solution for privacy, or if you see something else on the horizon in the tech department there.
I think it's a profoundly powerful concept. And I do think it's a sort of mechanism that will endure in the same way that public key cryptography, is a concept that's decades and decades and decades old. But we still use it every day. It's like sort of the bun on our burger. You can't hold anything without it and have it endure. Or actually more than that, it's the wrapper on the burger. We need ways to transfer and exchange. And in order to do that safely and reliably, we have to be able to protect that. Now we know, thanks to Satoshi, right, how to do this publicly and reliably in a trustworthy manner. And that is a tremendous achievement, right? Unfortunately, the fact that it is so public is what's really starting to harm us now. If we take those sort of public key cryptography building blocks and we find a way to take it to the next level, which is what zero knowledge proofs are really all about, is to establish that you have the ability to prove you know something, or you have the authority to do something without actually revealing anything about what that is, a transaction or a type of knowledge or whatever. For those who are not familiar with it, one of the ways I think is interesting to kind of demonstrate what a zero knowledge proof is, how it works, is showing somebody who's red-green colorblind a red and a green ball, right? And you let them mix them up and show it to the other person, and the other person can reliably go, this is the red one. Now, they can't verify that themselves because they look the same to them. How do they know it's true? Well, they could do it 1,000 times and there's no difference. But if you have a verifier, a validator, someone else on there, where these aren't coordinated people, you could pull a different person off the street every time. And he goes, this is the red one. And the other person goes, that's right. That's the red one. And then you go, it's not 2 balls, but there's 10 million balls out there. And this person always picks the correct one. You have now a sense of sort of reliability. Even though you can't tell the difference between this ball and any 10 million others that look exactly the same to you, you know that someone out there can establish this. They can go, this really is that. Now, if we can do that with money, now we can start to show I have the right to spend some token on the network that's not even associated with me in any way. But this kind of protection, where you go, we can engage in sort of monetary expressions of agency across distance without having that instrumentalized and weaponized against us, having that sort of next page, next line in our transaction history layered into the permanent record of our lives that are being established by all of these different groups, whether they're social media, whether it's the banks, whether it's the government, right? We are more free to act without permission as a consequence of that. And the ability to act freely without permission is what we used to call liberty. And that is very important, I think, to maintaining liberty in a world where we are increasingly reliant on digital intermediation of our lives. If we're acting through screens, if we're acting through a distance, if we're acting through hostile networks and hostile institutions that owe no allegiance to us, we need a way to protect ourselves, not just against some criminal out there or some dangerous government or whatever, or even our own governments or the local cops, but from everyone at the same time. Because again, the best way to protect anyone is to protect everyone. If it's a mutual guarantee that we all benefit from, that's much better. That's much more reliable. It's much more uncontroversial. It's much more robust than selective privileges that are granted to human hands that will inevitably abuse that authority.
Yeah, it actually, I wish I could remember the title of the paper, but when I believe it was Sylvia Macaulay and a couple others who published that, I'm never going to remember the name, but it was sort of introducing zero knowledge proofs for the first time. They note poetically in the paper that the privacy of some information is what gives us an advantage over our adversaries. And so, that was in like the mid 80s, but, years ahead of their time, they could see that if your information, if your data, whether it's whatever you're doing on chain or anything else in your life, is you are, someone is getting an advantage over you when data becomes a public good like that. And you have to ask yourself, what is the information I can't see? If your information is fully public and the rest of the information is not public to you, then that would mean, by definition, you're operating at a disadvantage. And so hopefully zero knowledge proofs can be sort of the tool that levels the playing field for a lot of people. And certainly at Offshift, that's something we're working on very much. I do want to bring up into the conversation sort of one of the development challenges that we faced, because right now operating on Ethereum, crypto is in a very nascent place. And Ethereum's infrastructure, I would say, is emblematic, or is the epitome of that sort of nascence, where using for us to create some sort of confidential assets, we call them ZK assets, and we were employing and are continuing to employ bulletproof ZK proofs, was so computationally intensive, so to speak, there's no such thing as a free zero knowledge lunch, that to conduct that kind of computation on chain on Ethereum layer 1 in a fully decentralized environment exceeded Ethereum's single block gas limit. And so even with optimizations and various things, it becomes prohibitively expensive to sort of the mass market. And for it to be inclusive and open, which is sort of what this space is supposed to be all about, we have to find ways to drive down the cost. We have to find ways to create solutions in the near term. And I think a lot of projects in the space, and it's not to name names or to disparage anyone, but we're kind of starting to see it's kind of like trying to email someone a 10-minute video in 1999. The application potential is limited by the infrastructural, I should say, capabilities. And so it's sort of this challenging dilemma that a lot of projects face. You're like, well, we could just compromise on the decentralization a little bit, and it's going to really make the user experience pick up big time, and it's going to make it easier to implement features and do a lot of things. And I think the thing that we sort of forget about is that if we really want to move in the direction of centralization again, we're moving backwards, and that is what makes these sort of blockchain-based systems exciting and meaningful. And so something I want to ask you is sort of, where do you see this situation, this sort of dilemma where we have to put out something, we have to protect user privacy in some way, but if we're going back to centralized systems, it creates, at least in the interim, while blockchain systems haven't quite yet matured, where do we stand? How do we operate in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have people who make different decisions when it comes to contending with the trade-offs, right? The purest approach is to recognize that in the fullness of time, doing it right is going to be the solution that endures. In the interim, there are people that are going to get a huge and frankly unfair advantage for cutting corners. But we've seen, particularly in stable coins recently, how that kind of reasoning can really blow up. And it's not just like the Lunaterra stuff that people see where they've got, just garbage out there that's being passed off as something reliable, something that people can trust, something that people can depend on. But we see it in legacy stuff too. When you look at something like Tether, when you look at something like even Coinbase's sort of stable coins, people go, oh, they're stable, they're backed, they're collateralized, whatever. People go, oh, we can't tell how Tether's backed, but it hasn't blown up yet. Or they go, well, Coinbase is regulated in the US. They say they've got $1 for every coin they put out, so that's trustworthy, reliable. But at the same time, if you look at the contracts that these coins are actually sort of working through, the expression of what that coin is, they've got like blacklist operations in them where they can just at any given time go, nope, all of these coins get burned, they get locked down, they can't be moved, they can't whatever. That is a tremendous failure in what anything that could be called a stable coin should be. It's an unstable coin, right? It's stable as long as they permit it to be. And then you've got these kind of things where they can just emit coins at will, and you have to trust that they're doing it right. Like there's a billion problems with that. People are like, oh, algorithmic stable coins are bad. But you actually look at things like sort of DAI and MakerDAO, and they actually have a pretty reliable system that doesn't have those flaws. And it's actually been working really well. When, they've had peg breaks, it's like instantaneous during a, black swan moment, like a COVID collapse, but then it springs right back. Because people can see what's in the system. They know how it works. They see every gear turning. And we can rely on what we know because we're not relying on people. We're not relying on institutions. We're relying on code. And at least we can understand, or hope we understand, how code works. And short from those kind of failures, that is a better way to construct these systems. They are understandable, they are public, they're open, they're available. And again, there's not this level of interference. There's not this level of indulgence and like people poking around at the system and go, oh, these guys are going to re-collateralize, or they're going to intervene, or they're going to do this. When you have it out there, when you do it right the first time, you do it for the long haul. And these other projects will rise and they'll fall. They'll, get all the press and then they'll disappear. They'll sputter out. But the ones that are architected correctly and done the hard way might actually endure.
It's heartwarming to hear that. Yeah, I have to tell you because we've been trying to do things right, and decentralization has to be number one. And yeah, I certainly do agree. There's a lot of noise in this space, in crypto, and in the financial space in general. If you look in traditional finance too, there's always, whether it's the Madoff stuff or anything else. SPACs have been all the rage, SPACs, and I certainly that resonates very much. That putting integrity first, and putting your principles first is what wins out in the long term. And certainly there are some different approaches, though, which I think are quite interesting now, as you see sort of the emergence of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where you have people that say, yeah, like we don't want to have some sort of centralized system, but there is some role for governance. Or there is some role for whether they believe in monetary policy or just basic rules governing the protocol, and that the principle or the paradigm in cryptocurrency, even in Web3, is that you sort of you're a participant, and that the participants own the network, not some sort of distant figures in an opaque boardroom, and so. I want to sort of ask get your take on governance in general, especially seeing as what that there's just so much. I'd say it's just a very open-ended space right now, and where governance is going. But I would like to read one quote, and this is actually a tweet, and it really, it's actually from a year ago, but it really was thought-provoking for me, and so I wanted to at the very least run it by you here. But it says, "In a democracy, power is given, not taken, but it is still power. Love, compassion, caring have no use for it, but it is fuel for greed, hostility, jealousy. All power corrupts. Take care which power you allow a democracy to wield." And that quote, that tweet was actually the last tweet of John McAfee's life before he died in jail. And I think it really provokes a lot of thought, because we seem strangely obsessed with the methods and means by which we confer power and decision-making capabilities to individuals, more so than those powers themselves. We sort of seem to be quite comfortable with, democracy today is sort of an acceptable and even honorary pretext for mass violence and human rights violations. And I think it's especially important within the context of your situation, because if you were to return to the U.S. and to be tried, it would be under the Espionage Act, which means that the motives for the decisions that you made and the actions that you took can't be examined by the jury. And that really elevates the government to the status of an arbiter of morality, and even an arbiter of truth, rather than its original, preordained purpose, which was to protect and serve the people. And so, if even any democracy can be eroded, what is your take on governance in general? What is the best way that humans can self-organize peacefully?
That's a big question.
Yeah, we're going deep.
A good answer for that. But look, the general principle here is governments are intended to advance and further, I think, human cooperation for collective human benefit. When we start seeing them act for selective human benefit, that's where we know something's gone wrong, and we see something's gone wrong, right? And this is not just the United States. We see it happening in every state of a certain size. And this is one of the interesting things. We see that smaller governments tend to be better governments. They're more connected to their constituents, and they're more responsive to their constituents. Because when the person down the street can come and knock on your door, you're more likely to take them seriously than if you're, basically the Nancy Pelosi type that lives in a castle surrounded by people with machine guns, as you direct sort of what's going to happen to everybody within the fence of your country. And this is really, really the struggle. Because if you look at it sympathetically, if you look at it compassionately, the most generous interpretation of why these people do what they do, how all of these states of a certain size get it all so wrong in the end. And you set aside just the fact that, as McAfee was saying there, inevitably power corrupts because humans are flawed. You go, they are struggling with the same problem that technologists feel so naturally, which is how do we scale a nation? How do we scale a planet, right? How do we make our tribe and all of the tribes get along and work? And I think they're making compromises. I think they're not architecting it correctly. I think they're architecting it quickly. And so compromise after compromise after compromise, they realize they've compromised themselves and their nation. And that's the hole that we're in today. We are ruled by people without principle and powers that are increasingly being made irresistible. How do we correct for that? I think we need to recognize that these were problems that were already solved in an earlier generation, just like how a lot of people are trying to reinvent Bitcoin by missing what made Bitcoin so special, by sort of re-centralizing the decentralized idea, which is there are things a government can't do, even if it's popular, even if the majority supports it. This is called a right. Rights are protection against the majority. And I think we've very much lost sight of that. Now we seem to believe today that the majority defines the right. And as our political passions swing from one side to the other, as these moral panics sort of wash over society, we're constantly getting whiplash, and sort of new enemies are being raised up and smacked down. And there's constantly a new threat. There's constantly a new problem. And if we just give the government more power, if we pass a new law, if we narrow the borders, the boundaries of our rights more and more and more and more and more, everybody will get along because they're all standing on the head of a pin. And we're each, sort of trying not to fall off the one tiny micron that we're allowed to stand on. And if you deviate in the slightest way, if you are blown with the breeze, if you sway, everybody will turn and they will hate you and they will act to destroy you. And they will believe what they're doing is right. They will sincerely and genuinely believe it's right because you are deviating from what is popular. Now, back in the day, when we established a constitutional government, we constituted it as a limited government. And this was the idea that there were things that the federal government could simply never do. And everything else was up to the states and blah, blah, blah. Wherever you fall on these kind of issues, the core principle there is being lost. And there is an authoritarian mood rising around the world, regardless of flag, regardless of language. You will see that people are so traumatized by the flow of information that is being delivered to them by networks, broadcast and digital, where the worst thing on earth is shown before their eyes relentlessly every day, that they feel that they are in danger, that they feel that if they do not act, they will be destroyed. And as a result, they say, you must do something, you must save us, you must get rid of whatever this thing is. Half of these threats are imagined, or they're not real, or they're not serious, or they're not likely to impact them, or they could happen, but just the same way as a lightning strike could hit your home or yourself. It's not something that can be countered with sacrifice. And we have to build resilience. We have to build compassion. We have to build sympathy into our societies to protect and care for the victims while continuing to progress forward. Otherwise, we're entering this period of human history that really feels like a great regression.
It
and I think
reminds
the
me.
more... Go ahead.
I was just going to say that it reminds me of I think it's a quote that privacy, the role of privacy is to protect the minority in any democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the majority, again, sets the mood. They say what is favored and disfavored. They are the great establisher of the normative behavior that's so much in the discourse today. And it is the non-normative, the people who are a little bit different, who are a little bit unusual, that stand out, that have even heretical ideas that need to be protected, because that's where progress comes from. It's not really the majority that drives progress, because the majority says the world as it exists today should be kept the same, generally, typically. And it's the people who see the world as it is, who see how flawed it is, who says this doesn't work for me. These are the people who do something different, who say it could be different, who say, well, let's go to the moon. And everybody else says that's impossible, or it's not right, or it's outrageous, or it's heresy. But if not for those people, if they were identified, if they were stamped out, if they were limited, if they were chained down, if they're put on the head of the pin, we would never have gone there. And I think we need to remember that we have to make space for those that are different for us. And that should not be a controversial idea. But today it very much feels like it.
It does. It does. I hate to, or I like to pull a page from your playbook here, because there is a famous Native American proverb that goes, "It is impossible to awaken someone who is pretending to be asleep." And so, it's important to allow people to sort of, innovators, you could say, even just, but people with controversial ideas to sort of have an opportunity to act out their beliefs, because that's really where the change comes from. Public discourse and dialogue is rarely enough to change the opinions of people that are sort of aligned with the status quo. And sort of at the risk of being extremely cliche, that seeing ends up being believing. And so on that note, that really is the perfect segue to the biggest question that I have, which is a very personal one, because when this really comes from a conversation that you had with Joe Rogan, and I believe it was episode 1368, where he kind of sits in with you and says, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of people in the world that, they're just so busy. They're just trying to pay the bills. They're trying to feed their families. And they even know that some of the things that they do in their daily lives are objectively wrong. But they also know what happens to people who rock the boat. And rocking the boat is extremely risky. It's not just some sort of, irrational fear. The people know what happens when they sort of step out of line or when they go against the current. And I think, what you did in particular, you're sort of hailed as a very, like an intellectual contributor in a lot of ways because of your tech background. And I know you've scored, I believe, in 145 on a pair of IQ tests, which, for anyone listening in who's not aware, that puts you, as far as the bell curve is concerned, on the far, far, far right. And that's not a political remark, I promise. But I mean, it's sort of, I don't really think, because there are many people in the world whose IQs are very much in that realm, who fully disagree with the decisions that you made and who would like to see you in jail or worse. And more so, there are people all over the world who go through every day sort of living in their own shadows. Everyone has some sort of passion or some sort of thing inside of them, some unique expression of morality or something that they truly believe in, that they wake up every day and suppress. And it takes tremendous courage. And I think that's what really is one of the most inspiring parts of being human, is seeing other people who are willing to make sacrifices, to put everything on the line, all their chips on their table, as all the skin in the game that they can put. And in spite of the fact that they don't need to. And, people fill up stadiums to watch athletes who do this, even to watch performers who do this. But I think in particular, your story is very inspiring, profoundly so, because you were living, I believe, in Hawaii. Pretty nice out there. I've never been, but pretty nice. And
it's nice.
Yeah. Don't want to rub it in. But I mean, you're living out there. You're making good money. You don't have any reason to rock the boat. You have a good woman in your life, and your family comes from a military background, I believe. So you see something that feels wrong, and a lot of people see things that feel wrong, and they feel wrong about them, and they know that there's some sort of corrective action that they can take, but it involves taking on tremendous risk and sacrificing a lot of what they have or would have. And I think for anyone who's listening in, the vast majority of human beings do not take the measures that they know they need to take. And so, I mean, I want to ask, just for everyone, and for myself certainly, if you can dial down the humility as much as possible, like, what does it take to do what you know is right, against all the odds in the face of tremendous uncertainty, the disapproval, rejection, and dismissal of others? What does it take to do what's right simply because it is, to uphold your principles until your last breath?
It's a tough one, because I think today now that I have kids, and I have no free time. If I was back in Hawaii right now, I'd be going to work, spying on everybody all day, and coming home exhausted to try to take care of the kids, put them to bed and get up to the next morning to do the same. Would I have been able to do it? And, a lot of people see it as just, oh, this person's a hero. Right? Daniel Ellsberg and I have a great long-going debate on this about should we call people heroes or not. He says we should, because we need to encourage people to come forward, to set the example, and to basically defend them against, as you said, the great smattering of critics that never go away, the sort of authoritarian impulse of humanity, which I think is actually the most common part of that sort of political tribe, to go after the boat rockers and throw them in the volcano. And I actually say we shouldn't call people heroes. We shouldn't do that, because you're otherizing. You're recognizing that, you could not have been Daniel Ellsberg if you were in the same position. He was someone exceptional. He descended from heaven on the cloud, the halo shining, and did what other mortals could not. But you could have done that. And you could do it today, in the same way that I did something that a lot of people say was a very difficult thing, but, a necessary thing, the right and proper thing. And that's what I believe, right? But I also didn't want to do it. I knew the consequences of rocking the boat. I'm on camera saying they're going to charge me with the Espionage Act. They're going to call me a traitor. They're going to say all these things. They're going to hound me basically to death. And that's all bearing out. But you also have to ask yourself, if not you, then who? And what will happen if none of us act? Now, I don't believe people should martyr themselves. I don't believe that you should just sort of throw yourself in the volcano for the good of the tribe, particularly if you're not sure it will make a difference, and especially if you're not sure you will succeed in whatever the gesture is that you're trying to make. I was in a unique place in my life, a unique place in the nation, where I was one of the only people who could see so broadly across the NSA's network, the CIA's network, the sort of entire intelligence community's network, because they were bridged together through these different things. And I happened to have the keys to be able to VPN stitch them all together, to gather the evidence to really make the public argument clear what was happening. I also had the technical background to actually get this out of the building without being detected. And I believed I had the background to get it to journalists before I was basically thrown in a hole. That was a gamble. I could have been wrong. But I thought about what would happen to the internet if the rise of mass surveillance had continued in secret for another 10 years. Even if it had been for another 2 years, I think we would have been a much darker future than we are today. That guy at the very beginning of this talk, the bald guy rubbing his head, sweating when the senator's asking him, are you spying on millions of Americans in any way at all? And he's going, no, sir, not wittingly. Oops, I guess it's just an accident that it's happening. He said, trying to condemn me on the sidelines of sort of the Aspen National Security Conference talks, that I moved forward the adoption of strong cryptography by 7 years. And he said this is like one of the most awful things that anyone could do. It was a terrible thing. And to me, it was tremendously flattering, and it was validating, because it made me think that even where the laws might not change, even where people's opinions might not change, broadly in public, right? It's very difficult to change the entire majority's opinion about something. But if you can change enough opinions in the right place, people who can actually make a difference in the technological field, right? When we're talking about this, we can encode our principles into mathematical laws to serve us in the same ways once that natural laws did when governments were less powerful. Now governments are trying very hard to overturn natural laws, right? And it's a question of how we respond to that. So it's a question of, how do you come forward? What do you do? I think you have to look at, is this something you're capable of? And recognize that there's no special, like, you're not, excuse me, like, carved from a block of marble. You're not granted. I'm just a normal guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time and saw that what was happening was wrong and went, what would people do if they knew? And well, now we know, right? Sort of the government's not going to reform itself, and people aren't going to fight a revolution over the internet. And maybe we don't even want them to. But the people who put the internet together, people like you, right, can start to put it together differently if they know the way that our trust is being violated. And sometimes that's enough. And I think that's what it comes down to. Every day, we see things that are done wrong, and we don't intervene all the time. We don't think it makes a difference, or we don't think it matters, or we don't think it's a big deal. But we all know in ourselves when it is a big deal. And we feel when something is truly wrong. And we have to ask ourselves, can I resist this? And if you go, maybe, possibly, I can make a difference here, you have to ask yourself, why not? And if consequences are the only thing, stopping you, you go, well, what are the consequences on the other side of the equation if you do nothing? Because you will have a hand in building the world that you did not want to live in. And for me, that's really what changed my reasoning. Like, we still have the problems that we had back then, but now we're doing something about them. It hasn't been enough. It hasn't been fast enough. But the act of progress has begun.
Well, it sort of reminds me of there's this sort of I'd say a little bit of a metaphor where, you have everyone in the ring and this is where society is. And you want to get right up to the edge of the ring and you just kind of want to move it over a little bit. But if you do too much and you're not, and you just jump outside the ring, then you kind of get cast away and you don't really have that impact. But I will say that I respect immensely what you've done and the principles that you've acted upon, and I think your children are very fortunate and will grow up to do something similar in their own right. It's really...
I have to go put them to sleep. So
yeah.
I'll let them know you said that.
They are in very good hands. And I'm sure when they're old enough, they will be able to see that quite clearly. But on behalf, again, I do want to say, on behalf of the team and the guys that are anonymous and that really seeded this project in its early days, conceived it and really started building it. They are even just as much as myself, inspired by what you've done, grateful to have spent the time with you. And we're sort of picking up the torch here and we're building.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and to you and everyone listening, stay free.
Thank you. You too.